Hi everyone. For this particular video, I wanted to read out loud a review and critique of Judas Priest's recent album that just came out a couple days ago, Invincible Shield. And specifically, my critique concerns its Zionist qualities. So what I'm just going to be doing for this video is reading what I wrote. And I've also decided that for the future, I think, unless I feel it absolutely necessary to, I won't be showing my face as I record, by and large, because I don't think it really adds much to the videos, and I'm also fairly self-conscious. So instead, you'll just be getting my screen as I read, and you can focus on the writing and the images and things that I've supplied instead. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Judas Priest, Invincible Shield, and Zionism. This piece considers the Zionist potential of the new Judas Priest album, Invincible Shield, i.e., from a postcolonial lens. Being a fan of their music since high school, for over 20 years now, a part of me takes no joy in doing so. But all the same, part of me does. I'll gladly sacrifice the sacred image of my childhood heroes, if it means liberating Palestinians, and by extension all oppressed groups. I may not succeed, but I want to try because it's worth trying. Certainly I can enjoy Priest while criticizing their pernicious aspects, and, as Anita Sarkeesian put it, doing so is both possible and necessary. Otherwise, what are we doing? If anyone wants to know my opinion about the music itself, i.e., merely as a product divorced from geopolitics, I'd say it's fairly mid overall. While tracks like Panic Attack, Invincible Shield, and Gates of Hell absolutely catch fire, the album fizzles out in the second half. The instruments are certainly solid enough, with Richie Faulkner being the usual MVP from Redeemer of Souls onwards. But a curious lack of memorable guitar riffs or catchy choruses leaves a distinct lack of impression post-listen. Still, the old bag of tricks includes a cache of dueling guitar solos and harmonies, driven reliably onward by Scott Travis's double bass kick. They get the job done, more or less, but I found myself pining for some actual lyrical depth and memorability over flashing in the pan. Instead, it largely feels like the band phoning it in, sporting a Ghost of Painkiller attack that comes across as lyrically basic upon basic. They're not just posers, but posers of their former selves, arrogant enough to put a gold Jewish police badge, surrounded by the red and blue color scheme of police sirens, on their album cover, but singing as lazily as possible about the rudiments of mass hysteria, Panic Attack, jingoism, Invincible Shield, and Bible imagery, as God is my witness, and the serpent and the crown. Seriously, it sounds almost like Christian rock, Priest's finding of religion all the more forgettable, given their gothic anti-Christian past, having challenged the very things they now embrace. Jesus wept. The moment I laid eyes on the new album art, I completely hated it. 1, it's ugly as hell. 2, the Priest logo, already Jewish-like, is woefully crass. That is, an incredible album cover, a friend tells me. Wondrously distasteful, evokes the smell of freshly licked boot leather, Zionist in the most anti-Semitic ways. Suspiciously embedded inside another Jewish simulacrum, the Priest insignia serves as an unironic police badge in defense of British imperial shores, which, like any police state, are built to expand outwards while colonizing themselves inwards using tokenized barriers, i.e., us versus them, e.g., humans and aliens, cowboys and Indians, Jews and Palestinians. So while Halford croons Invincible, our masses are united, invincible forever and a day, invincible can never be divided, and nothing can stand in our way, Invincible Shield. We're left with the current abuse of Jewish imagery by white British men to serve a settler colonial project happening in Palestine. Bear in mind, abuse needn't be direct and overt, merely complacent inside adjacent allusions that yield the same historical material effect through some degree of ignorance, neglect, or disdain. So not only has claiming ignorance become something of a bad joke in the internet age, but the abuse of oppressed pedagogies aligned with the same acts of bad faith performed by poser moderates who should know better and yet choose to play the rebel and the lawman. For us, this means priest, even though the problem is far older than them. For instance, as the time-tested tradition of punching Jews became uncool after World War II, Jews became tokenized to punch down, i.e. against themselves and other oppressed groups, thereby serving the same old profit motive as part of capitalism out of antiquity. In turn, Priest seems to have emblazoned their album with such a badge despite the Palestinian genocide happening next door, evoking a party disturbingly similar to Israeli settlers. Despite some bad actors being far more active in ongoing misinformation campaigns, Invincible Shield sadly feels like Priest saying the show must go on, while using such imagery to line their own pockets. It feels at best willfully obtuse, i.e., the modern equivalent to selling sugar during British abolitionism instead of honey, despite knowing full well of the Caribbean sugar, the slave trade. All the same, Priest's commodifying of struggle at the cost of human life is merely the chickens coming home to roost. Our metal gods staying silent on what should be blasted from the loudest speakers imaginable. One can turn a buck and still be an activist. Priest's current failure to do so, especially given their history of conscious political awareness inside their older catalog, with fabulous albums like Sin After Sin and Stained Glass, successfully marrying Gothic critical power with metal, thus medieval theatrics, tragically evokes Martin Luther King's rueful adage, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Priests are not Palestinian and can afford to stay silent while stubbornly using Zionist settler colonial imagery to emboss their latest album with. Et tu, Brute? First, I want to direct your attention to the art in question. Consider the menorah-esque symbol Priest have incorporated into the album's shield design alongside what appears to be a rough approximate of a Star of David. Now, the artist who came up with this combination can say whatever they like, as can Priest or their fans. The conscious intent doesn't matter, material outcomes do. In the case of Shield, we clearly have a likeness of Jewish dogma raised in defiance of perceived enemies, i.e. state crisis as something to endure and overcome through a claim of righteous invincibility. This perception thereof and its dialectical material framing is settler colonial, insofar as it's precisely the kind of mentality fostered by those who, normally designed to benefit from a settler colonial project, feel threatened by its imminent collapse. In other words, these are ancient religious symbols being used in ways that align with old to new means of imperial conquest from Rome to America and its allies, trained to attack enemies of Christendom, i.e. as a neoliberal capitalist hegemon, according to the natural duality and duplicity of human language executed inside the material world. For our purposes, look to the father of the Israeli right, Ze'ev Jabotinsky. People seem to forget that Zionism was overtly expressed from its outset as a settler colonial project endorsed by the British Empire, already in decline at this point. Faced with resistance from those they sought to conquer, this led the colonizers to make some rather frank conclusions, Jabotinsky writing for the Haaretz Daily in 1923. Quote, "We cannot promise any reward either to the Arabs of Palestine or to the Arabs outside Palestine. A voluntary agreement is unattainable, and so those who regard an accord with the Arabs as an indispensable condition of Zionism must admit to themselves today that this condition cannot be attained, and hence that we must give up Zionism. We must either suspend our settlement efforts or continue them without paying attention to the mood of the natives. Settlement can thus develop under the protection of a force that is not dependent on the local population, behind an iron wall, which they will be powerless to break down." Unquote. This constitutes the shield aspect of the settler colony argument, except there's a second half. Quote, "Settlement can thus develop under the protection of a force that is not dependent on the local population, behind an iron wall which they will be powerless to break down. A voluntary agreement is not just possible, as long as the Arabs preserve a gleam of hope that they will succeed in getting rid of us. Nothing in the world can cause them to relinquish this hope, precisely because they are not rubble, but a living people. And a living people will be ready to yield on such fateful issues only when they give up all hope of getting rid of the alien settlers. Only then will extremist groups, with their slogan "No Never," lose their influence, and only then their influence be transferred to more moderate groups, and only then will the moderates offer suggestions for compromise. Then only will they begin bargaining with us on practical matters, such as guarantees against pushing them out, and equality of civil and national rights. Unquote. Here, the alien side of the shield is both Jabotinsky talking about himself and those he would seek to dominate, spelled out in clear, open language, reflects the bare reality of the public mindset regarding settler colonialism as an unchallenged operation, a uniform to wear, not question, as Jabotinsky does below, a bitch of the crown, a dog of war hounding his own people. Except the myth of public consensus can be felt in British culture regarding slavery viewed as an unalienable right and as something to reject entirely, depending on who you are then and now, e.g. Jane Austen's resistance of imperialism, thus genocide. Despite Austen not saying the quiet part out loud, I acknowledge how Edward Said, the architect of postcolonialism, is a little too quick to go after Austen in culture and imperialism. As I write in my own essay, Ghostbusters, Afterlife, and Empire, in the second volume of my book, Sex Positivity, quote, Austen certainly wasn't above critiquing the open, if deliberately moderate bigotries of Anne Radcliffe's own Gothic Orientalism. The further east you go, the darker it gets. When writing Northanger Abbey, written in 1803, published in 1817 after Austen's death. We shall press these Gothic voicings to our advantage in this essay. My point about Said is that I think he, ever in a hurry to outline the very real and ever-pressing presence of American imperialism in the Middle East, thoroughly underestimates/discounts the ubiquity and degree of the powerful forces that Austen was writing under as a white woman. It would be a mistake to lump Austen in with so many of her imitators and contemporaries, in part because her Mansfield protagonist, Sutherland rightly points out, belongs to the Clapham sect of evangelical Christianity, which hated plays and light morality only less slightly than it loathed slavery. Said's overall conclusions certainly aren't wrong about imperialism, but his assertions about Austen are largely words put into her mouth by his pen, Kinky, which he then argues with to make his point. The problem is, he assumes her silence to be indicative of a particular kind of guilt when Austen's shame at writing at all became a matter of legend after her death. How could I possibly join them onto the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labor? Unquote. Sutherland being John Sutherland, where does Sir Thomas's wealth come from? Is Heathcliff a murderer? Simply put, the embracing of settler colonial genocide and imperialism through the nation-state has never been a universal position. Instead, genocide is a thoroughly ugly business, making the greatest weapon of the colonized their counter-terror ability to present themselves as human and their conquerors as inhumane. Regardless, both sides use the same monstrous rhetoric to achieve goals that are diametrically opposed: profit versus liberation. In short, there isn't a monopoly on shields or aliens on either side of a settler colonial exchange. Moreover, the cryptonymy of state abuse is felt through these contested popular symbols, regardless of who's using them or why. Unlike the colonized, though, the settler colonist uses the shield or the alien to defend a colonial position in bad faith, i.e. to keep enacting colonialism while pressing inland as the Roman legion would, presenting themselves as human, righteous, and self-defending for the glory of Rome, and more importantly, its emperors revived in the present day in some shape or form. This includes heavy metal, but also video games and other popular forms of media, where the Aegis, per Barbara Creed, is a source of protection that from the outside is required by Cartesian thought, i.e. what I describe in my book as Cartesian abuses that treat nature not simply as female, but monstrous feminine food that harms indigenous peoples, racial minorities, and GNC people, so-called incorrect or non-men of the white, cishet European sort, to varying degrees of settler colonial genocide, by cheaping their lives, their bodies, their labor to serve the profit motive. Unquote. In short, it's a harvest, and a grim one, that needs shields and aliens as part of a settler colonial scheme relating Gothic, thus metal language. Medusa must die, even if, as Creed points out in The Monstrous Feminine, achieving this is impossible. Quote, when Perseus slew the Medusa, he did not, as commonly thought, put an end to her reign or destroy her terrifying powers. Afterwards, Athena embossed her shield with the Medusa's head, the writhing snakes with their fanged gaping mouths, and the Medusa's own enormous teeth and lolling tongue were on full view. Athena's aim was simply to strike terror into the hearts of men, as well as reminding them of their symbolic debt to the imaginary castrating mother. And no doubt she knew what she was doing. After all, Athena was the great mother goddess of the ancient world, and according to ancient legend, the daughter of Metis, the goddess of wisdom, also known as the Medusa. Unquote. Cryptonymy, words that simultaneously hide and evoke trauma. At the same time, the Internet's subsequent raising of settler colonial awareness poses a substantial problem for capital. Acknowledging the human struggle of those brutalized by our perceived defenders, canon then demands an obscuring of the imperial factors at play, lest capital recede. Quote, a monstrous enemy is out there and we are defending ourselves and our cultural purity from them while pushing the alleged foe back. Unquote. Military expansion is concealed behind a false flag that trumpets imperial action dressed up as self-defense from Medusa, communists, Nazis, or some such menace in a capitalist realist sphere. More vital still, this is often displaced to an imaginary antiquity that revives through dead symbols that, when dug up, become cloaks for the colonizer to hide his bloody work with in plain sight. The Nazi did it with the crooked cross, but the same basic idea works to priests' own symbol. It's in their name and their logo, the two synonymous with a position of settler colonialism as post-Roman, i.e. borrowed from Caesar, insofar as the ruler is lionized through his position as indicative of himself. Caesar, then, is a label demonstrative of the first person who held it that others are trying to imitate well into the future, including priest. Settler colonial echo-praxis yields a variety of likenesses that, in the imperialist tradition, are ripped from the imaginary past. Simply put, the language yields a historical usage that has become replaced in the present to fulfill an imperial aim that has become settler colonial. The overtly racial character of settler colonialism did not exist during the time of the Romans. It was pioneered by Columbus and then developed more fully by the British, according to Levia Gershon's Britain's Blueprint for Colonialism Made in Ireland, against their own populations in the mid-1600s, then spread around the world through Cartesian dualism to fuel the Enlightenment engines of capitalism, modern war, and nation-states as they presently exist. There's clearly a relationship between the past and the present, but it's a complicated, ongoing one that repeatedly swaps out images to hide capitalism functioning as normal. The cosmetic features might shift and transform over the years, but the basic function and its socio-material outcome remain fundamentally unchanged. Bringing things back to Priest, we have a paradox common to the Gothic mode insofar as the operative tendencies of the Gothic survive in heavy metal as both a product of then-current material outcomes and a past imaginary tradition that contended with its own set thereof. It became a desire to escape for those trapped within the imperial core, sitting ignominiously close to its war engines, insofar as capital forces money through nature to serve the elite by harming native populations. An ordinary steel mill needn't be converted to a bomb factory, if its own industrial potential is absorbed into the same national body to conduct imperialism with. Quote, with Judas Priest, the Midlands and metal reinforce each other with a wonderful literal mindness. Halford's dad was employed at a Walsall metalworking company, making components for nuclear reactors. Guitarist Glenn Tipton not only shares his surname with a Midlands town, but was also an apprentice at British Steel. Judas Priest are the sound of the blast furnaces that once studded the Midlands. When we were kids walking to school, says Halford, we'd walk past these metal foundries and see the molten metal coming out of the big vats. We were literally breathing in the fumes from these metal works, breathing in metal before heavy metal had even been invented. I'd be in school trying to do English literature, and the classroom would be shaking because of the machinery. We really did grow up in a labyrinth of heavy metal, says Tipton. Huge foundries, big steam hammers. It also gave you a determination to get out. Music was the way chosen by the members of Judas Priest. Unquote. The invention here isn't a claim but a fact, one to stake by those who ultimately profited from it. The complexities expand insofar as the class character of the band was poor and white, with Halford also being gay in a notoriously homophobic Great Britain. Such pioneering mentalities and repressed topics, re being gay, echo in British culture within capitalism as evolving across a series of generations in their creations, e.g. Tolkien's Black Country, and own repressed queerness, a byproduct of British culture evolving with the times to play second fiddle to the United States as the supreme hegemon post-World War II, and already the rising economic superpower the world over by 1895, 3 years after Tolkien's birth. The point with Tolkien and Priest is that both were born in the shadow of British greatness as something to potentially return to through an evocation of imaginary pastness. Tolkien did it with his own pro-Beowulf leanings, surviving into the present through a cartographic refrain, and Priest's 70s Gothic rose during the new wave of British heavy metal scene to then carve out a territory for themselves in the nascent metal community and its expanding cultural imagination worldwide. Their ceaseless myth-making centralizes themselves inside a kingdom under attack by its own exploitation of others. In regards to Black Country, I'm referring to Stuart Jeffrey's Mordor he wrote. The problem is, the bigotries and socio-material factors on either side of a settler colonial project remain at play insofar as they fetishize and alienize nature within a Cartesian harvest, of which orcs suffer, but are also sexualized, above. For Tolkien, I write in Sex Positivity that, quote, dogma is the tool of empire, and Tolkien wasn't shy about using it. His story's not just full of cops, castles, and victims, but acting as a steady excuse to turn off one's brain, as being over half a century old at this point, i.e. Neil Isaac's introductory essay to Tolkien and the Critics. Since The Lord of the Rings and the Domain of Middle-earth are eminently suitable for faddism and fanism, cultism and clubism, its special appeal acts as a deterrent to critical activity. Clearly, it's a sore spot in academia, as accustomed to looking the other way, not a surprise given how accommodated intellectuals behave, a sign of institutional guilt tied to the castle and those who live there as coming out to commit colonial horrors. The worst castles are the pearly ones, or as I said in my thesis, ACAB, all canonical castles are bad. Indeed, the only difference between people like Tolkien and the Nazis is a matter of degree. Regarding the operations of their mythic structures, both worked in service of the status quo, e.g. Gondor is worse than Barad-dûr because it will last and continue committing genocide. Again, Tolkien believed in the state, even with reduced powers, and the state is the ultimate foe. Unquote. While in regards to the survival of Tolkien's bigotries in modern-day forms, I likewise cite Dr. Stephen Shapiro. Shapiro wrote to Rediff in 2003 regarding Tolkien's racism in Peter Jackson's adaptations. Quote, put simply, Tolkien's good guys are white and the bad guys are black, slant-eyed, unattractive, inarticulate, and a psychologically undeveloped horde. In the trilogy, a small group, the Fellowship, is pitted against a foreign horde, and this reflects long-standing Anglo-European anxieties about being overwhelmed by non-Europeans. This is consistent with Tolkien's Nordicist convictions. He thinks the northern races had a culture and it was carried in the blood, while Tolkien describes the hobbits and elves as amazingly white, ethnically pure clans. Their antagonists, the orcs, are a motley dark-skinned mass, akin to tribal Africans or Aborigines. The recent films amplify a fear of a black planet and exaggerate this difference by insisting on stark white-black color codes." Unquote. The same problem of inheritance and legacy is likewise faced by Priest, who have the potential to say a great deal inside Gothic theater to challenge settler colonial convictions. But as moderates reveal, they don't have any convictions they actually stick to. Indeed, their 1978 album, Stained Class, is thoroughly postcolonial. "Who's the savage? Modern man," sings Halford on Savage, but also evoking the image of the shield and the alien during Invader off the same album. "We warn you now, you things out there. Whatever you may send, we won't give in without a fight until the end. With vigilance day and night our scanners trace the sky. A shield is sealed upon this earth, a shield you won't get by." And yet as time went on, Priest sold out. Their critical lyrics became deliberately dumb, starting with British Steel into Painkiller, the latter being something to emulate with Invincible Shield as pastiche of something that, far from becoming a joke, has become canon to espouse whatever dogma the band wants to enrich themselves with. It's an empty ghost of a reinvention that remains holy. Like the titular Painkiller, curiously summoned out of the imaginary past during a time of civilized collapse, thus medieval apocalypse and rapture, and laden with mythical symbols ejected from their historical context to fulfill a new goal, Priest have become something to call for and preach a new wisdom to the masses. And yet out of the ruins they're ripping themselves off, and other musicians to boot, with their musical mascot clearly inspired by Meatloaf's Phantom Biker from Bat Out of Hell. This brings us to the famous and mysterious Priest insignia. It dates back to their second album, Sad Wings of Destiny, but which the band have deliberately injected into their logo since 2008's Angel of Retribution. Not much is known or said about it as far as I could find, the band staying quiet on it when remembering Sad Wings 35 years later with Malcolm Dome, but it remains highly ubiquitous and arcane, i.e. serving both as cryptic heraldry for the Painkiller's knightly armor, stamped on the shoulder like a military badge, while he defeats alien forces in times of state crisis, thus decay and collapse. All serve as part of a pointedly medieval regression, one whose proposed damnation and salvation operate through the unironic worship of force. In short, it's fascist obscurantism, made to elevate the band both in terms of wealth and status, as heavy metal gods who look after their own as a kind of flock to part from its wool. E.g., Halford explaining in 2020, "We love our fans. We would never put anything in our music with the intent of harming them." Unquote. Except also having another revelation that hints at the parasocial and parasitic relationship between bands and those who support them. Quote, "I had to sing Better by You Better Than Me in court, a cappella. I think that was when the judge thought, what am I doing here? No band goes out of its way to kill its fans." Unquote. Priest, specifically Halford, also recognized the judge as a staged, imposing presence the singer likened to himself when viewed by his own fans on stage. When you're in court, you always see this guy in the back with a gown, and he's very imposing and very dramatic, and it's amusing. I think of the judge like the fans think of us when they see us on stage. What's he really like close up? Has he got feet and all that business? In the same documentary, cited above, Halford also curiously describes himself as an intellectual who writes about dark lyrics that aren't American love songs. But the fact remains that capital accommodates him according to his relationship with fans, loving him in ways that cater to their fragile, white worldviews, i.e. as things to defend using heavy metal as comfort food, not activism. This reflects in Priest's metal pastoralism, which in modern times assists in capitalist realism by a bunch of posers who suck precisely because they're making hay, while Palestinians are being killed on a military-industrial scale. So much for being an intellectual, as Edward Said would call himself in representations of an intellectual. Though Priest ain't got the guts to challenge their own position despite fans around the world loving them. They've proven for decades they will exploit 70s-era BDSM fetish gear, the Nazi echo, and biker leather daddy culture. That, I think, speaks to the complicity police bear in things, and the other fragility of capitalist realism as a transactional process. Better to keep mum regarding the quiet part and posture as a hero, than kill the hero by speaking truth to power in consequential ways. All very ironic, considering Priest's immortal line in Hero's End. Why do you have to die if you're a hero, when there's still so many things to say unsaid? The idea has become the institution, except per Frederick Jameson's postmodernism, this means blank parody, a statue with blind eyeballs, remediated through endless pastiche. Posing as liberators and rebels, priests with Invincible Shield have become deaf, dumb, and blind. But as men behind the curtain, I think they're either well aware of it, or they don't care enough to challenge their own brand as part of a Zionist capitalist enterprise. The idea of heavy metal warriors certainly isn't unique to Britain, with American band Kiss's Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons both being Jewish. However, the problems I've outlined above clearly survive and continue to thrive there, as integral to Priest's own evolution, i.e. is a band that has grown to worldwide fame and recognition through the language of settler colonial violence. Aliens show up and make people scared. A champion and his shield-like body are summoned, returning the state and the people to greatness through a medieval hauntology and aesthetic. The logo becomes synonymous with the name and the actions of a person whose mantle is taken up by future protectors, hiding their own brutality behind a call and response, e.g. the bat signal. The Judas Priest symbol is really no different, effectively taking ancient non-Christian symbols like the menorah, or rather a weird convergent likeness of it, and imbuing them with a fresh sense of settler colonial purpose, i.e. during imperialism's ongoing evolution inside capitalist realism, expanding the imperial potential of revivals of Caesar through an endless series of counterfeits. In turn, these forgeries drive profit through infinite military conquest as dressed up in symbols of recuperated oppression, a rock and roll army. In regards to Kiss, as John Stratton writes in Kiss, Jewishness, Hard Rock, and the Holocaust, Kiss was a hard rock group, one of the most successful during the second half of the 1970s and early 80s. The group's two founding members, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, were both Jewish. Indeed, both were the sons of Holocaust survivors. This article examines the impact of Simmons's and Stanley's Jewishness on Kiss as a rock group and on its success. One of the most obvious impacts was the drive to succeed, which Simmons and Stanley shared. Simmons writes about wanting power, Stanley that he wanted respect. As children of survivors, they wanted safety. During much of the 1970s, the Holocaust was not yet publicly acknowledged. However, its trauma is evident in, for example, the stage characters that Simmons and Stanley adopted. To this, capitalism and Judas Priest have recruited Jewishness to serve settler colonialism through a metal voice that has lost much of its irony but none of its dogmatic potential. As Mark Fisher, the author of Capitalist Realism, would put it, the future envisioned by Priest is cancelled by imaginary forms of the historical past that revive ceaselessly in the present to maintain capitalism everywhere. For the band, this serves the profit motive first and foremost. Never mind that the settler colonial project carries on in Palestine, reminding the world that time is defined by space, chiefly distance and material conditions, a historical relic of the past for those who arrogantly call imperialism of the past, demonstrating that they have, more than anyone, fallen under the spell of capitalism, i.e. when summoning up modern-day Beowulfs and similar such patriarchal demons, ghosts, and so on. As Gerald Hogel writes, vis-a-vis David Punter and Leroux's Fantôme and the cultural work of the Gothic and the undergrounds of the Phantom of the Opera. Quote, in the Gothic, from the later 18th century on, as David Punter has shown, the middle class often does what we have just seen Leroux do in Le Fantôme. It displaces the hidden violence of present social structures, conjures them up again as past, and falls promptly under their spell, with feelings of both fear and attraction towards the phantasms of what is displaced. Unquote. Yet per Hogel, the ghost of the counterfeit furthers the process of objection to enrich the same old class of persons, the white European male, as the Hamlet-grade center of the tale and its Gothic madness. As part of that project, Jewish colonizers are just that, colonizers recruited from the colonized body to police themselves and other marginalized groups, mainly Arabs, during the same old Gothic dialogue. Regardless of who, tokenization serves the Protestant ethic ever present under capitalism through a time-tested Darvo trick. We're Jewish and defending ourselves. Except it's still a police badge handed out inside a concentric settler colony, from America and its borders to far beyond them in ally nations to beyond those, inside faraway alien territories, where the machinery of capital can operate most nakedly, as obscured by distance and heavy metal insignias. Confused? That's really to be expected at this stage, except the merging of inside-outside, that is to say a threshold and its assorted conflicts and crossing together from moment to living moment, unfold during a liminal state of invasion, agitated confusion. These are not strictly of one dialectical material flow, but multiple directions engaging back and forth using shared language. It's anisotropic, thus can be either of the colonized feeling alienated inside or outside the settler colony, at home or on its frontiers or neighboring lands, or can apply to the colonized being made to feel alien. Criminal, incorrect, illegal, undocumented, etc., through the same forces and language at play. And yet further complexities arise when you also have those who are colonized or colonizing others at home. The colonized are operating through the same borrowed language as their victims, save the fact they are employing it specifically during a Darvo scheme. The shield is a defense mechanism to invoke, raised mid-invasion against perceived outsiders during moral panic, fears of state collapse, /overreach, and foreign plots, Nazis and communists, humans and demons, heroes and villains, all occupy the same messy sphere during us versus them. To this, Priest is no stranger to the kinds of operatic forces I've just described. Raising the cathedral is something whose English myth of history feels both sinister and invaded, but nevertheless at home, i.e., home is something to defend from alien things making us feel foreign, thus to some extent xenophobic. I say us insofar as it applies to a prescribed in-group meant to react predictably against an outside force. Island fortress mentality. In times past, the British Isles were invaded from the water and the air, a fear of invasion that survives during inheritance anxiety of a settler colonial project that is, for all intents and purposes, in decline. The former empire in which the sun never sets is just a bit player in American geopolitics, fantasizing about its own imperiled castles, i.e. the myth of sovereignty challenged inside the chronotope, the liminal hauntology of war. Likenesses haunt themselves as part of this ontology. Whatever castles raised by Priest then, these will be haunted by the very spectral and faceless metallic things they refuse to sing about now, but once did, using the language they've grown accustomed to abusing, having the iconoclastic potential to push back against genocide. Priest, the people up close, don't care about that anymore. They care about their legacy as something to sell to Americanized fans worldwide, i.e. by singing about invincibility as a Zionist privilege they invoke time and time again, while Palestine suffers for longer than Holford has been alive. He was born in 1951. Israel was founded in 1948. Invincibility needn't be abandoned, indeed, to borrow from another musician. We can't afford to be innocent. Stand up and face the enemy. It's a do-or-die situation. We will be invincible. Except the enemy here is capitalism, and people who enforce it through settler colonial dogma, including Zionism. Our invincibility, then, lies in challenging these persons to become something they can't monopolize, thus control us to enrich themselves with. As per my own arguments, we must make metal gay in ways that Holford, if he ever tried, has long since abandoned in exchange for homonormative godhood. Oh, the irony. Thank you, everyone. So, concluding this, I'm an anarcho-communist sex worker, genderqueer activist, and Gothic ludologist. I sometimes write reviews, Gothic analyses, and interviews for fun, or does independent research for my PhD on Metroidvania and speedrunning every now and again. I'm also an erotic artist and writer. If you're interested in my work or curious about illustrated or written commissions, you can refer to my website for more information. You can also, on there, find my book, which isn't actually linked here, But in the days ahead, I will be reading more articles that talk about that too. So if you like this kind of thing, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think of Priest and my thoughts about them and Zionism. Again, I'm a big fan of Judas Priest and have been for over 20 years, but what they're doing currently isn't okay. Even if the album was much better than it is, in terms of it just being musically consistent and catchy and what have you, they would still have to not be making Zionist arguments, which their album art does in relation to its lyrical content and music material. So, yeah, that's how I feel about it. Let me know in the comments. Also, one thing that I'm thinking about doing is VTubing. So having a little VTuber avatar at some point. I feel a lot more comfortable with that than I do in just recording myself in front of a camera for a variety of reasons, though mainly I'm lacking a studio that I feel actually contributes to the production in any meaningful way. I look like a professor in a basement, which is basically what I am. So, all of that being said, if you like what I do, like, share, and subscribe, and feel free to share this with other Priest fans who have a post-colonialist mindset. And until next time, guys, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video. Take care.